Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. So I thought it might be a good idea to create a tutorial where I go over my painterly style of illustration. Here are some pieces that I've worked on in the past, and I want to walk you through how I work with this technique. And it's especially timely because this month we have a contest, and the specifications are that you can't use any line work. So this might be helpful if this is a style you want to work with. So the first thing I start with is thumbnailing, and I'm going to go over this in more detail. But essentially I work with thumbnails, I get it to a semi-finished state, and then I do research. So I rent or buy costumes, and then I take photographs so that I can get a feel for what the wrinkles might look like and how the light might affect the cloth, and get some good perspective reference for the human figure. So here's an illustration that came out of that photo session. And for this video, I'm going to go over this illustration, which I worked on last week. And so to start out, as you can see here, I'm in Photoshop, and I'm just creating thumbnails. And I already had the idea and the concept in my head for what I wanted. So I'm just diving in and trying to figure out what's the best way to frame a character being strangled by these worms. And it has kind of like a funny aspect to it, because in the foreground there's one of those jars that has those little gummy creatures that you put in the tub and they expand, and it's going to say right on the label, just add water. And so the idea is this jar fell into the sink, and lo and behold, they turned into big giant worms or slugs that are strangling this guy who happens to work in a product testing lab. So here's a more refined thumbnail, and you can see I'm starting to do some research, and I'm going online looking for pictures to get some inspiration, get a feel for what would be some interesting textures to try to pull off in the illustration as I paint this. And then for the figure itself, I'm using Armature 9, using the white version of Ranger, and I put a costume on him. And this is even better than having a real model, because I don't have to worry about how long it takes, and I can, at any moment when I feel inspired, I can pose the doll and take pictures from different angles, try different lighting arrangements. And once I've got all my research and all my reference ready, what I do is then I start to refine the thumbnail itself. And I'm doing this all digitally in Photoshop, but I would say all this process applies if you were to work traditionally as well. But I work really small, so that thumbnail that is colored is probably about 200 pixels high, so it's pretty tiny. And I'm just refining it, trying to see how close can I get to the finished product while working at this scale, and solve all my problems with the composition. So that's positive and negative shapes, light and darks. Try to make all those big decisions at this stage, so that then when I start working on the details, I don't have to be hitting those kinds of roadblocks if those decisions haven't been made. So something that might be valuable for you to see, or you'll appreciate it a lot more, is if you watch my lecture on composition. I have a video that you can watch on this channel that goes over specifically some tips and techniques on how to arrange things in a rectangle so that you can guide the viewer's attention to the focal point. What are some different techniques for creating eye circulation? And I also talk about positive and negative spaces and that visual language. So if you watch that video, I think you'll have a much greater appreciation for some of the things that start to happen in this composition as I get further along with it and start fleshing it out. So something else I should mention is that I'm taking a very painterly approach with this, so I'm not working in layers. Other than sometimes I'll add a new layer to paint over, just in case I change my mind, I can delete it and start over, that kind of a thing. It's sort of like a mega undo layer. So if I want to go in a direction that I'm not sure of, I create a layer and I start painting. But inevitably, if I like what I've done, I flatten it back down, and I just, for the most part, work flat. And what I'm doing is, because I've established all my color palette in this thumbnail form, I don't have to keep going back to the color picker, so I just use the eyedropper tool and the brush tool, and I toggle between the two using the Alt key on the keyboard. So really the only tool that I have active is the brush tool. I hit the B key on the keyboard for that. And then I hit Alt to toggle back and forward between brush and eyedropper, brush and eyedropper. So there you can see the photo reference, one of the many pictures that I took. In fact, as I was doing this, I had the doll itself on my desk with the clothing, so I was able to look at it even more closely and from various angles, just shifting my head around as I was sitting at my desk working on this painting. So I could get some ideas for different wrinkles and folds that I'd want to accentuate in the illustration. Now for geometric things like that jar and the desk in the background, I often rely on the selection tools. So I'm using the elliptical selection tool and the lasso tool so that I can get really clean masks for those areas. And you'll notice too that as I'm working on the character, or if I'm working on the jar, I bring in that reference and put it beside it as I work so that it's something I can look at and get some ideas. Here I'm using the text tool to get me started on what the text is going to say, which is just add water. And then, because I'm still in thumbnail form, and this is all very low res, when I get to the point of making this larger, and that will be about 2000 pixels high, I can then proceed with continuing to paint over it with this technique and flesh out the details a little further. So now I'm working on the desk in the background, and this reference that I think I found on Craigslist is giving me some good ideas on what kind of a cabinet I want to have. And there's a device there. I'm not sure what it does, but it has an interesting sort of beveled shape and a little display. I'm going to put that in the composition later on. But I think this gives you a pretty good sense for how this all works. It's actually very simple. There's not much to it. I'm just using the brush tool and the eyedropper tool. And initially, I do go into the color palette and find my colors, but once I've kind of blocked all that in, I just have to hold Alt and toggle to the eyedropper tool and then keep painting. Alt and then paint, Alt and then paint, and just flesh it out. So here I'm skipping ahead. As you saw there, I've scaled up the thumbnail quite a bit so that I have more pixels to work with. I think it's probably about 500 pixels large now. And that gives me a little bit more detail, more resolution to start working out some other details like the hands and where the fingers are and where the facial features are going to be. Try to nail down what that angle of the skull is going to be. I've departed quite a bit from the reference, but of course that's fine. The reference is just there to help you have a point of departure and give you some inspiration. In this case, specifically for wrinkles, because that's something that I personally am not really good at. And so having the armature and being able to put doll clothing on it has been amazing. Having to get costumes is really expensive, and of course it takes up a lot more room in your house as you collect them. So from now on, I'm probably just going to be investing in more costumes for my armature, because it's easier to store, they're cheaper, although not always. They're not always cheaper. I find most of them on eBay, and they're some really, all the items I've gotten have been really great quality, and the stitching, the scale, all you have to do is search 1/6 scale doll clothing or props, or if you're looking for a specific prop, like you could probably search 1/6 scale hammer. You could probably find it. I recently got some sports themed items like a bat and a cap, and I'm going to be doing a baseball themed illustration. So yeah, it's been really handy to be able to add costumes to the armature. So because I have all this extra resolution, I can really now tighten up some of my details and really commit to the shapes and the wrinkles and where the light is going to be hitting different parts of the figure. So that's what I'm doing. I mean, the technique hasn't changed. That's what's really cool about this technique, is that from the very beginning, from thumbnailing, I was simply using just a brush, and it's a hard-edged brush with opacity that changes based on pen pressure. And I'm using a Wacom Cintiq tablet, so that's the kind that you can draw directly over the top of. You can see though how this could potentially take a long time, because everything that I've done there on the face, I'm going to have to do everywhere else. But the great thing about having worked at a much smaller scale to begin with is I can trust, as I'm doing this, that the composition is going to work, and that the values are the right values and the colors are the right colors. So as long as I don't depart from what I've established, and I work within those constraints as I establish these details, then it's going to work when I zoom all the way back out. And you can see how, while I'm certainly borrowing a lot of the wrinkle ideas from the reference, I am also departing from that in places, because I know that if I spend too much time fleshing out the wrinkles on his clothing, it's going to be a huge detraction from his face, which is what I really want to be the focal point. And that's why I put that picture frame right behind him, to sort of frame his face and also create a high contrast. And it adds to the story too, because he's leaning back and he's causing all sorts of havoc in the process, tilting the picture frame. Things are spilling off the edge of the table. And so it really works to have that there. But I noticed, and I'm not showing it here because I don't think I recorded it, but there were some times when I spent too much time on the wrinkles and ended up adding so much detail and realism to them that they ended up being a distraction. And so one of the tricky things to balance whenever you're working with this method, where you're being painterly and realistic with your illustration, is to do so in such a way where the entire composition is there in service of the story and the focal point, and not detracting from it. It's a really tough balance to achieve. It's something I'm still working on figuring out. And this is why the masters like Michelangelo and Rembrandt and Lumiere and all these great painters of the past are called masters. I mean, they figured this out. They knew how to do this well. And it's always comforting to know that their greatest works came about when they were at their oldest age. So I feel like there's still hope for me. And I encourage you to take a look at our contest this month, because the theme is no lines. It's not much of a theme. It's more of a technical constraint. But if I were to submit a contest entry, this is probably the technique I would use. But there's no limitation to what techniques you can use to solve that puzzle. We had somebody submit an entry that looked like it was done entirely in vector, and it was all shapes with solid colors, and it was beautiful. And it definitely solved the problem in her own way. So look at our contest entries. We post one every month, and the details are on armature9.com, and there's a monthly contest button at the very top. So take a look at that and participate. We get about 20 entries usually every month, so your odds are pretty great. We give out over $200 in product prize money, so specifically so you can get our armatures for free. And let me know if you have any questions. You can email me at store@digitaldouble.com, or you can visit us on facebook.com/armature9. I hear things are really coming together. I ended up darkening the foreground quite a bit. It's an important part of the story, but it's kind of something I want you to discover after you look at the guy being strangled by the worms. So it's the palette slightly cooler in the foreground, it's darker, and it's blurry too. And I did blur it using one of Photoshop's filters, the Gaussian blur. But even after I did that, I went through and used the painting technique where I would alt and toggle toggle back and forward between the brush tool and the eyedropper tool. And if you're looking to get good at rendering and portraying different materials like the glass and the metal countertop and things like that, the only way to really get good at that is to draw and paint from life. So do still lifes. I used to do all sorts of them, draw flowers, vases, things like that, and you'll eventually get good at portraying different materials in your own illustrations. And even though most of this is out of my head, I clearly relied on reference. So there's no shame in that. In fact, most artists from the past would set up an entire stage in their studio with all the models dressed up accordingly. They'd have all the furniture there and essentially paint from life. But nowadays that can be pretty expensive and time-consuming to do. So now you can see that the changes that I'm making are so subtle you wouldn't even notice them if I hadn't sped this up, because they're very, very minute. And it's the kind of stuff that wouldn't necessarily show up on a website, but if I were to print this out like a poster size image, then you would pick up on the little defects if I didn't take the time to go through there and clean it up and refine my contours and the details, and blending different areas where you can see really crude brush strokes. So that's essentially the phase I'm in right now, is the final polishing phase, where I just go through all the little corners and all the little details and make sure everything's cleaned up. I'm respecting all the colors that I've already established, because if I stray from them, then I run the risk of ruining all that work I did early on of establishing my colors and my lighting and my shapes and my positive and negative spaces. But at any point you can correct. You can course correct at any point. That's the beauty of working digitally, and to some extent traditionally if you're working with oils. So finding if there's tangencies in places, positive and negative spaces that aren't interacting well with each other. And again, the video that I have on, it's called The Secrets of Composition, is a real good one to watch if you're looking for ideas on or things to look out for when you're arranging a composition. Here I've skipped ahead a little further, and you'll notice that I've overexposed some areas just to, I kind of like the heightened contrast and drama, especially that spill of light coming through the door, and there's the guy in the back kind of wondering what's going on over there. The hardest part for me with this composition was balancing things, because there were so many different bright colors that I wanted in there to make it clear that this was a guy that works with children's products and he tests them for safety. And so because I have so many different colors and different values, it was really tough to keep the eye focused on the main character and then wander away and look at some of the other things. To add insult to injury, behind the guy is his business license. And, it was probably the kind of moment where you wonder to yourself, so this is what I went to 8 years of schooling for, or whatever. So there you have it. If you found that interesting, please thumbs up the video or subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be having some more interesting tutorials coming up. In fact, the next one I think is going to be about sculpting and post-processing 3D printed products, so you get nice smooth results. So keep a look to stay on the lookout for that. And if you have any questions, let me know through email or through Facebook, like I said earlier. And I look forward to hearing from you. If you've got questions about the technique, leave them in the comments. I'll be happy to reply as soon as I see them. Thanks, guys. Bye.